Hey there, fellas. So look here, we have a G-wagen, but there is a slight issue. The diesel engine it was running failed, but let's get this thing back on the road with the help of some unconventional means. Let's do this. Now, the G-Class is a serious off-roader, but the thing with these trucks is that they absolutely need to have a V8 engine. The issue is that those versions are just way too expensive to be able to use this vehicle for its intended purpose. Ours cost us 600,000 rubles or $7,000, and the main theme for this build is going to be keeping it as cheap as possible. That means using the cheapest engine we can. This is a ZMZ 511, a V8 engine for a PAZ bus. It only cost us 30,000 rubles or 350 bucks. Prior to tearing this apart, we're going to laser clean it, to at least be able to see the threaded connections in order to properly dismantle it. And from there we're gonna tear it down, examine the pieces, and work out what needs to be done. The reason we're doing this is that we don't just want to slap the engine in. We also want to give it some extra power, and overall just give ourselves a little peace of mind. So while we're prepping the engine for disassembly, we're gonna quickly take the G-wagen apart, remove the diesel engine, look around to see if there's anything we can reuse, and throw out whatever we don't need. One spot and you got every single means of fastening. First you have some electrical tape, then some scotch tape, a screw, some metal wire, and cable ties, and all within an area of 5 square centimeters. We got lucky, the engine is in good condition. However, that being said, you'd think we can just install it and it'll simply work. We don't want the G to be good for just a couple of days. We want to be able to take it on long trips and so on, for it to be up to that sort of thing. And so while we've got the engine torn apart, we'll freshen up the pistons, give everything a clean, bring everything into good working condition, and make a few minor improvements. The situation with the crankshaft is pretty interesting. We've removed the plugs and this sludge. That's about from 1 or 1.5 journals. So would just one journal contain this much gunk? And what's most interesting is that, if I understand correctly, it builds up on the outside? On this side, yeah. That is the inertia at work. So all of the oil and filth is being thrown up, and whatever is heavier than the oil, it builds up on the outside. And this is the result. Good thing we tore the engine down to have a look inside. See what condition the internals are in. My goodness. Real talk, I've never seen anything like this before in my entire life. I couldn't even imagine it would contain this much sludge. Now, if we hadn't taken this engine apart and cleaned it, and just filled it up with some quality oil, well, it probably would have started, but it wouldn't have even lasted a couple of kilometers before failing. This is actually a very tedious process. Cleaning everything, getting all of the parts ready for assembly. It took us more than a week, but it was definitely the right call, and this will ensure the engine is put together properly. And with that, we have gotten rid of the weak point of this truck, which is the old engine. And we won't be making a bunch of other major changes, because we do want to leave the stock driveline and the gearbox, as those are the best thing about a G-wagen. Immediately we have an issue with how much this here weighs and how much lighter this is. The hardest part is figuring out the weights, because if we install this, and it only weighs about like 7 kilos at the most, this assembly has got to weigh a couple of times more. Feels like a good 25. Here's the idea. We'll put this onto a lathe, remove as much material as we possibly can, then we attach the torque converter straight to the flywheel. Bolt it right on. Because we are going to be running part of the bell housing for the 511 engine. If there's not enough weight, we're going to have to bring the revs up. And that is not good for the health of an automatic transmission. We won't be able to shave too much off, only about 30%, to allow the engine to rev more freely. But that should do the trick. This plate that secured the torque converter, we won't be needing that. The idea is to bolt it straight to the flywheel. We're now working on the cylinder heads. And while they're disassembled and clean, now is a good time to modify them. Here's what we're gonna do. We're going to do some porting, open up the intake and exhaust ports, which should really help with high-end horsepower and torque, which is always a good thing. And the smartest thing we can do, of course, is increase the compression ratio. In its current form, it's tuned for regular gasoline, but we'll turn it up to about mid-grade to open up some horsepower. The 511 engine is very similar in design to older American V8s, of the type they used to make back in the 50s and 60s. That's what inspired us to try and make this engine look like one of those. We do want this engine to look good on the outside as well. The engine is now ready for some mods and for final assembly. Now, we didn't set any specific deadlines for this build, but we spent the most time putting the engine together and preparing the transmission for installation. We really want to do a proper job putting this engine together, because with this being a Russian engine, as a matter of fact, Soviet even, it was designed ages ago, it utilizes rudimentary technology, but despite how simple the design might seem, assembling it is very difficult. It can start leaking from pretty much anywhere, engine failure could occur due to the lack of some sort of washer, or because the contact surfaces somewhere haven't been properly matched. And therein lies the main issue when working on old Soviet engines. So check this out, guys. The engine is almost done, all of that is good and well. All that's left to do is stick the transmission to it. The really critical thing here would be to properly attach the automatic transmission. Because if the transmission is misaligned, you got the oil pump drive in there, and the turbine wheels that might become displaced. And that in turn might cause some serious problems, and quickly too. Even though we're trying to do everything right, we are still facing some serious risks. That, for example, during the initial shakedown we break the automatic transmission or the torque converter. If the auto cries, so will we. Now, the most curious bit out of everything we're using for the build is this... that piece of the bell housing. The bell housing is the weak link. That's because we only have half of one. After we trimmed this piece of the housing to the correct length, the auto box started sort of falling into it. Indeed it did. With it being too small. And the best thing we could come up with was welding on some steel... I meant to say some aluminum plates. We got all of that machined, and now we're going to install the auto box, get everything level, and make sure the box is placed perfectly on center. We need to make sure this aligns. Fingers crossed that it all comes together where we want it to. So this is a pretty ridiculous situation. If we were to install the engine as it was when it was on the floor, we could have fitted it to the G-wagen and it would have worked. And I'm going to be completely honest here. The entire process of putting the engine in could have taken us a week, or maybe 2 at most. If we just fitted the engine as is, without rebuilding it or modifying the manifolds, and just glossing over the minor things. But we've been at work for a bit over 3 weeks. Yeah, I'd say it's a bit more than 3. And the G-wagen still isn't quite ready yet. We're almost there, there's not a ton of work left. But these modifications were really time-consuming. Now, the first thing we want to do would be to start the engine and just make sure it's capable of running. To do that, we just need to fit the carburetor and set up the fuel system. Oh yeah, and also there's the matter of the oiling system. The oil used to be filtered via that huge thing that was placed at the front and top of the engine. We've decided to remove all of that and replace the cartridge-type oil filter with a regular, sort of modern one. And that is going to require a complete overhaul. We've plugged the old system, that's all good. Now we just need to install the new oil filter. Here we have some hoses, a few fittings, as well as an oil cooler. It is also a modern design, and so it's gonna allow us to set up the oil filter. From there we're gonna have the cooler, and after that the return line is going to carry the oil back into the oil pan. Check this out, guys. This should be pretty interesting, right? The engine is in there as well as the transmission. You'll see we also have a radiator installed, a carburetor. Yep, everything is installed and the engine will be able to run. We've already adjusted the ignition. We sort of roughed it out. We've also tuned the carburetor. The engine operates like it should. There are a few things we should mention. Like it still needs an alternator, a power steering pump, we should have enough room. The reason we haven't fitted any of that is that we needed to make sure that the engine works in the first place. And now I suggest, you're probably curious yourselves, so allow us to show you how this new engine works. Okay, let's fire it up. The starter motor is currently hooked up. Well, you can't see anything from the inside, so yeah. Meanwhile, in the next garage over. What is that? Is that the Mercedes? Did they just start the Supra? That's enough, it is still a bit cold. Sounds great, though we might want to dial the ignition in. Yeah, we might. As for everything else, the carburetor is fine, all of the cylinders are firing. That means the ignition system works, there's no smoke. Everything is good and the sound is just epic. It's tough to say how it was recorded by the microphones we're using. It's got a much raspier note to it than a factory stock engine would, because we're running a totally different compression ratio. Also, the intake and exhaust have much better flow. We've actually filled this up with premium because on this sort of compression ratio, the engine at least has to be running on mid-grade. We can no longer put in regular 92 octane. But on the upside, the engine has gained about, hopefully, 15 to 20 extra horsepower. Hear how quiet it is? And smooth, yum. And all of the cylinders are firing evenly. The flames coming out of them are all about the same. I see this as an absolute win. And we were even able to get the engine to start the first time around. As soon as we connected a wire to the ignition, without even tuning the carburetor or the ignition system, we just sort of put the distributor drive mechanism into position, and the engine was just able to start. That is terrific. At this point, we have gotten a lot of work done. All in all, this build took us about 3 weeks to complete. And so that is going to be it for this video. The rest we're going to show you in upcoming episodes. We've got a lot of interesting stuff in store, and in our opinion, this is probably one of the best builds we've ever done. Yeah, it's where it's at. So make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss what's coming up next. Because I promise the experiments we got in mind, they're gonna be... Or wait, we're gonna be taking this for a drive. Yeah, next time you see the G-wagen, we're gonna be going for a full-on test drive. We might even find some mud somewhere. Use this thing like it was intended to be used. Oh, we're gonna do that 100%. We might even knock down a small pine or birch tree. Yeah, guys, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what we got in store for this car next. It is going to be a lot of fun, that I can promise you. To be continued.